Well, welcome everyone, Yama, and welcome from up here on Gomeroi country. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodianship of the land on which we're coming to you from, and also the custodians of all the lands of all the people that are joining in today. I'm personally up here on Gomeroi country, up in Moree. There are two other speakers are coming from Gadigal land down in Sydney. So thank you everyone for joining. And welcome. It's very special. Sorry, I think I'm back. Hopefully I'm back. So I want to pay my respects to traditional owners of country and those who continue to care for country today. And again, welcome very much to the final morning of knowledge sharing. And we've had such amazing feedback from these webinars. It's the last of the three, and it's been a great time of lots of people sharing knowledge, both on the webinar, but also in the chat box in this native grains space. And I really look forward to staying in touch as we go forward. This is just one part of sharing knowledge, but hopefully we'll be able to come together again over the next few years and continue to share knowledge and come together in this space. The webinars themselves are going to be up online by the end of this week, hopefully. So you're allowed to freely share these with other people, and we're going to try and put the chat box notes up there as well. You'll be able to find that on the Grasses for Grain website, which you can easily find by just Googling Grasses for Grain, and it will come up Indigenous Grasslands for Grain, University of Sydney. But Cara is also going to email the link to the webinars recordings once this particular one is over. We'd also, on that website, we've also done a few edited versions of these webinars for just little snippets, which are really good classroom-sized snippets if you want to use them for teaching. So also they can be found through YouTube, but the links to them are up on our website as well. Feel free to use and distribute them. Again, this is knowledge sharing. We want to make this knowledge accessible to people where it's culturally appropriate so that we can go forward together. And as this is the last webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the primary sponsor of these webinars, Local Land Services Northwest. And they're also very keen for us to lead to not only just sharing knowledge in a webinar, but formation of a bit of a group going forward. And I don't know how this might look. I don't want it to be coming from me. I want it to be coming from the community. So if you're interested in forming part of a group or being part of a native grains knowledge sharing group or something like that going forward, please stay in touch, and we'll be able to work on that over the next few weeks. And finally, I also want to thank the Sydney Institute of Agriculture for their support of me personally, and also this project at the University of Sydney. So with that, can I please introduce our first speaker? We're very, very honoured to have Chris Andrews joining us for this call. He works as the Managing Director for Black Duck Foods, which is the social enterprise founded by Bruce Pascoe, and has cultural oversight from the Yuin people down near Malakuta. And a shout out to Terry and Wayne, who are joining us from Wollagura, and the guys down there. Thank you for joining in. We're very, very honoured that you would share your knowledge with us, and through Chris and through your company, with all of Australia, and we're all benefiting and learning together. So thank you very much to the guys down there. And Chris Andrews, over to you.
Thanks very much. Hoping that people can see a bit of what I've got on the screen at the moment. Warramie and Garni from Gadigal, and Wada to all the mob down in Yuin country. It's been a pretty good journey this year, despite everything with Angela and the team up in Narrabri. It started with a Johnny Cake Day, which is always the best way to sort of meet people and eat a bit of food and discover a little bit about what we're trying to talk around. So nothing better than eating what we're going to discuss to really give it a bit of a sense. So part of this is we've talked a bit about the food. We've talked a bit about some of the challenges in the growing process. And my opportunity today is to talk about how we've founded an organisation to look at developing this. It's not what everybody needs to do. And certainly there'll be different models and different approaches. This is the one that we've taken, and this is the thought that we've put into the way that we develop our operation. And I think one of the key things about what we're trying to do is share what we do. So people can take bits that they like and do things better for their country. And we, in having that yarn, get to learn how we might do our work a little bit smarter and a whole lot better too. So we're not the experts in a whole lot of things, but what we are doing is giving it a bit of a crack. And as we try things, we're keen to keep in touch with different mobs to tell them and show them maybe what we've done and what we've learnt and what we've made a mistake doing. But so just probably a little bit of background on Black Duck Foods and the context in which we operate. We're an Indigenous social enterprise, so there's a real business part of what we try and do, and where our focus lies is really on the traditional growing processes that care for country, as well as making sure that there's a return of economic development to Indigenous people. Some of you probably know the fellow that founded us, Bruce Pascoe, and that gives us a great opportunity to have a starting place in terms of a farm to try stuff out, and that farm's down near Malakuta. So it got touched a little bit by the fires earlier on in the year. And a core part of what Black Duck's about is that we've made a whole heap of promises. So, you know, we've got missions and visions, and I'll get a bit to that, but we also have got promises, because I think it's really important for an organisation like ours to promise that we'll do things. So some of those promises are researching what the elders did and trying to figure out how that is adapted to now, better understand how elders manage country, and then identify the values that creates now. So it's this sort of transition of traditional knowledge, but in a contemporary space. And that's important as we discuss things about how our business looks in the future, how they grew food and sustained country and people all at the same time. And that's a real core part of a lot of what we're trying to do. How do we actively encourage Indigenous people to get employed into this sector is a big part of what our promise is. And another one, and this is really part of the inclusive language, this is not an us and them business. So part of what we promised is we want to inspire a broader Australian conversation and a broader inclusive Australian community to come along this traditional food, this traditional grain story. And we want to at least try stuff so other mobs that want to get into this don't have to start from scratch. And that's a real part of this sort of shared knowledge. Some of the other context around this, and you know, for people that are maybe new into this sector, it's important to remind everybody that in the bush tucker, and I'm not a big fan of the word bush tucker or bush food because it sort of tries to marginalise it and make it novel. But in that sector, Indigenous people get about 1% of the revenue. So much like everything else that's been stolen from our First Nations people, so is their participation in their traditional agricultural foods and processes. Notwithstanding that they've lost all that, the backdrop to that is Indigenous business is growing faster than anybody else in this country, and that the native food enterprises that are getting up and running offer a huge amount of benefits to communities that embrace them. I want to sort of get to that at the back end, because we heard a little bit about the economics of farming. There's a really big opportunity here for communities that get on board this. Anybody can go to our website and see this stuff, but I think it's really important as Indigenous organisations look at trying to replicate or try and do a bit of what we're doing. We've set ourselves up with a mission and a vision and a purpose. But the part that I think is really important is we've also set ourselves up with a cultural responsibility. And as Angela said, we operate as on Yuin country. So our responsibilities are to Yuin people, and we operate under a Yuin cultural framework. So it's that the Yuin stories, Yuin language, Yuin community that we are responsible to. So our model is not a Wiradjuri model or Gamilaroi model. Ours is a Yuin model. And it's really important for Aboriginal businesses, Indigenous businesses, First Nations businesses to be recognised that they don't operate away from country, they operate connected to country, and that country is connected to culture and a language and a people. And we try and highlight that. So I know this mob calling in from Ngari Ngari country. They run a Ngari Ngari organisation, and that's who they are informed by. And there's different mobs out there that are on this call. And it's about educating everybody else that's the responsibilities that you first have is to that country and to the people who share those stories from that country. And we as Black Duck, we operate on Yuin country. But as always, we then sit around a fire and have a yarn with all other mobs when we get invited to. So it's not us barging in somewhere and telling anybody how it gets done. We wait for an old-fashioned invitation, sit around and share what we're doing. And people can take that. Black Duck, like a lot of Aboriginal organisations, also a bit of a reaction to what is going on. You know, colonisation. So 250 years ago, Aboriginal people were dispossessed, and language, culture, traditional practices have all been attacked since then. A lot of Aboriginal people have been denied opportunities to learn and practice their culture. I think part of what we've all heard over these sessions is that industrial or European agricultural practices have caused irreparable damage to the country. We've lost biodiversity and at a faster rate than most other nations on the globe. And most egregiously, the education of Aboriginal culture in mainstream societies has been really remiss. And I think Bruce's book sort of showcased just how much the lies and the hidden knowledge had perpetrated into what we're getting taught at school. I think it's really important to recognise in the Aboriginal employment space that you've got to create safe spaces for Aboriginal people to come in and work, and culturally appropriate places. And I think one of the key things is government, while they've tried to help, have been a real barrier to a whole lot of self-determination. So part of what we're trying to do is how do we do it independent of government, or at least have that level of independence where the funds that we might receive down the track from government are very specific and intentional, but don't govern what we want to do in the future. It's really also important for us at Black Duck to sort of set up a framework on which we operate. So, you know, you can have your business plans, you can have your strategies. What we've got is we've got a cultural framework that guides the way that we make decisions about how we want to operate. And we bucket those under people, culture, and country, because you can't separate them, but they intermix. And so it'll be about different objectives that we're trying to meet in terms of the food sector, and we look at how do we measure the way we're doing well. We also look at what's known as systems change. So what we're doing, how is that changing the way we think on the farm? But it's also important and these sorts of talks and these sorts of conversations and yarns, and when we go out and have a yarn with different people, what are we doing outside of the farm? What's our yarn? What's our bigger yarn that we're encouraging everybody else to have? And that's about changing the way people see traditional foods, the way they view it. And because we're a business, we've got to make money. And we've said we want to be a little bit independent of government. So we got to make money. And we sort of identified two sort of core places that we're going to make money. One's going to be out of food, which helps when you're an agricultural business. And the other one is tourism, which helps when you got a fellow like Bruce involved in the organisation. Everybody wants to come and visit. Now we're out of lockdown. So we've looked at those two ways of making sure they're going to be the ones that make us sustainable into the future. They're the things that are going to pay for people to come on board and be employed with us. They're the way that our business will be sustainable into the future. And they're what we sort of look at in terms of our capacity to generate money to keep the business going. So we're all on board because we've all got an interest in the native grain. And I've borrowed a few of the words from one of Angela's offsiders who's written a little bit of work on farm economics. So from a farm perspective, native grain offers a lot of opportunity. You know, pasture cropping like Colin does, you know, you got perennial grasses, so cell grazing with cattle and sheep production. We've talked about native grain for ecological rehabilitation. That's where the marketplace is now. A lot of biodiversity loss, a lot of mines looking to rehabilitate mine sites, you know, at $300 a kilo for grass seed of questionable quality sometimes. There can be a fair bit of money in that if you're into it. I know a number of people in the sort of the regen ag market have got biodiversity offsets and getting credits for native grasses on their property, and they fence those off and don't touch them. There's obviously big opportunities in the soil carbon credit. And now we're talking about actually the whole native grain from a food perspective. So you can start seeing that what this does is that on my farm, I've just not got one opportunity. I've actually got a multitude of different opportunities to make money along the way. So I'm not going to make all my money from soil carbon. I'm not going to make it all from biodiversity offsets. So they add in to what I could be making if I'm doing native grain cropping. And I've got that option to bring on cattle or sheep for specific purposes to add to my income. But what you're doing by putting in native grains and perennial grasses is you're building up this low input sort of model. So the beauty about perennials, native grains, don't have to sow the seeds, they always come back. So that's a big cost out of competing against wheat. And I know Angela talked about some of the yields being about an eighth to a sixth of what wheat is. If it starts becoming a lot more profitable when you don't actually have to do all the process of putting seed back in, becomes an awful lot more financially viable when what you produce is double the protein level. So what we're building are these lower risk operations because they give you more flexibility. You don't have to spend as much money to get a crop out at the end. So if you purely looked at this from a farm perspective, then that's sort of what you'd see, and it'd start being attractive. And that's what we're seeing now, seeing regen farmers go, that's not a bad deal. Broadening the economics of this though, you start saying, well, if there's more and more people doing this sort of stuff, actually, what is that starting to do at a local regional level? And if we're getting into the economics of native grains, what's it doing in a local community or local region? And how does that start impacting us when we go down even just a simple idea of native whole grain flour? And what we're doing there is starting to build up milling capacity. And then we've got the local bakery and the brewer and a whole lot of other industries that can grow from using whole grain flour, whole grains in that sector. And that also brings in the agri-tourism, because nobody can travel overseas now. And if you're anything like me, you start to be, you know, the grey nomads are looking to go travel inland, and they might want to have a new loaf of bread every 50 Ks made from local grains from that country. And there's an opportunity to touch on that. There's also this broadening of the economy that starts bringing in the culture, so cultural tourism. And you can see that map from Tyndale where he talked about the millstones, and there's all this different country, and that map covers about 40% of the countryside of the nation, and there's different mobs in there. So from Wiradjuri mob, it might be they have Wiradjuri grain, and that's, or Gamilaroi grain, and that's starting to connect the language and the culture to the food. And that cultural tourism is exactly what they've got in Europe. Now, everybody travels around France, they have a glass of wine in one location, or they have some bubbly in that champagne. We've got this opportunity to broaden this native grain from just not what happens on the farm, but what happens in the town. And that's starting to link into acknowledging the value and the benefit of First Nations languages and stories and the opportunity to build up a cultural tourism business. But for an Indigenous organisation like Black Duck Foods, the economics of native grain is all about the people. It's the people working on country for country and with country. And one of the things that really guides us in terms of economic development for Aboriginal Indigenous peoples is about giving Indigenous employment and enterprise opportunities. These opportunities offer up a vast return on investment because 250 years of dispossession has meant that failed government policies have caused further and further harm and damage to our First Nations people and ostracised them. And getting them back and respecting them on country and their stories and their knowledge starts slowly, acknowledging the harm caused and trying to remediate that. So employment and enterprise are a huge opportunity for creating value and a huge opportunity for getting a better return on the investments that many government programs seem to fail. Other thing is, we're getting a whole lot of mobs on country. We're starting to get large scale land management. We're starting to get traditional knowledge back into the system. Holistic ways of thinking, not simple ways of farming versus environment, but the way that you connect the whole thing together. And the other part about this is you're starting to bring new partnerships and new investments and potentially with the private sector back on country. And you're starting to unlock a lot of that independence. So the economics for an Indigenous business is just beyond just selling food. That's part of it. But the economics comes from the benefits that you start delivering for people. And there's been a lot of work done in this area. There's an awful lot of studies in this area. But we see it in our own operations. We see it in every other operation where mob are connected to country. The well-being blossoms, the value blossoms, the language blossoms, the culture blossoms. It's an opportunity for Australia to blossom with encouraging and getting behind and believing in the benefits of a 65,000-year-old culture. So what are Black Ducks really keen to do in this sort of sector? Obviously, we're keen to foster the return of the Indigenous Native Grain Network. And we're really keen and supporting partnerships and networks with all different mobs who are committed to healing country and empowering economic development. We're absolutely promised and committed to sharing knowledge. So if you want to know what we're doing, we're keen to come and sit and have a bit of a yarn and share that story. Because at the end of the day, we want all Australia to see what the benefit is in terms of re-engaging with our true history and the knowledge that's kept the longest living culture alive for thousands and thousands of years. And we want to see that build a food system that works with the country that we've got and not one that you've got to pour a whole lot of chemical into the soil to grow. So that's Black Duck Foods in a nutshell. There's probably a lot more to that story, but in the spirit of trying to share today with a whole lot of other people, I'll cut it there. But the bottom line for us is it is important for us to make this into a business that does make money, but it's also important for us to acknowledge that this is a sort of business that also benefits people working on country and people that are allowed to work on country and develop their own sense of identity and develop their own cultural benefits as well. So that's a core part for us. So thanks very much, everybody. And I'll go back on mute for a while.
Chris, that was fantastic. Thank you. What a great overview into a success story. And everyone's encouraged to hear success stories. And we really appreciate you sharing Black Duck's food journey and business journey. And I know there's going to be lots of practical questions about the legal staff and how you set it up and who you need to talk to start a business and all these sorts of questions. So if you wouldn't mind having a little look through the chat box now and having a look at some of those questions. And also if you guys listening have something you'd like to ask Chris, pop it in the chat box. Chris might answer some of those while Beck's talking as well, but at the end, we'll have some time for some oral questions as well. That was awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, Rebecca Cross. Dr. Rebecca is a human geographer which I'm learning means something about social science. It's actually about connecting people and place. And so she's a researcher that's done a lot of work on both regenerative agriculture and also working with native foods and in Aboriginal communities. So she's based at the University of Sydney, but she's coming to us live now from her home. Is that right, Beck? Can we hand over to you?
Yes, sure. Thanks very much, and Yama to everyone. It's great to see you all online here. I'd just like to extend my acknowledgement of being on unceded Gadigal country as part of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. I'm still occupying this land and I'm yet to pay the rent, so hopefully in the future that can be remedied. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, not only on Gadigal land, but also to those who are with us here today as well. So as Ange said, I'm a human geographer, which I often get asked what that means, but basically we investigate relationships between people and place through sense of belonging, how place impacts identity, how people impact place, etc. So really we have a very location sort of focus to our work. So I thought I will just start sharing my screen now. So there might be a little bit of crossover with some things that Chris said, but I think that's good. We're just backing each other up here. So personally, I've done, yes, quite a bit of research in the regenerative ag space. And regenerative agriculture is really gaining a lot more traction. I mean, the people that started regenerative ag really got going in the 90s. And it's all about regenerating native grasses and refiguring your whole farmscape so that you're producing food, but at the same time, you're improving and enhancing biodiversity, conservation of soils, as well as managing water in a way that is healthy for the ecosystem and for future generations. As Chris said, there are a number of practices that farmers use. So rotational grazing in many different forms is one of those practices, which means that animals are being moved on. And even though there are issues around hard-hoofed animals in Australia, with strategic grazing, you can limit their impact. There's also pasture cropping or no-kill cropping developed by, farming innovators here in New South Wales, where you're putting a crop directly into a native pasture. So you're not taking away from those benefits of keeping that native grass system intact. So they're really holistic and integrated ways of reorganizing our food systems. And this sort of revolution in agriculture is really, I think it's really spreading in the last 10 years, and more conventional ag or conventional farmers and landholders are starting to become more interested in how they can do this. Maybe for some not on their main productive land, but certainly in their marginal and unused spaces on their properties. So regenerative agriculture is also about economic diversity, and a lot of farmers that go into regenerative ag, it's a long journey when you transition from conventional to regenerative ag. And as part of that transition, there's a natural sort of point where you have to take a bit of a loss in production for a little while before you can redesign, before you can regenerate that system to a point where it's just as productive as the system that you had in the first place. And for a lot of these farmers, they talk about, once upon a time, they used to focus more on cattle being their main focus. And now they've realized that cattle are actually just a tool to manage the landscape, and that the landscape and the ecosystem is what actually matters and is what is the basis of their whole business, as well as their connection to that place. And there are a lot of farmers that just anecdotally, I think around about 10 years after changing practices is when if there is a seed bank there, those really productive grasses start coming back. And one farmer in particular, I remember, he said he'd gone from 30 to 40 native grass species on his property to having up to 120 to 130 native grass species coming back in just 10 years. So the response of these environments is quick. So if we start changing what we're doing and maybe stop doing some things, these environments can bounce back. Just to move on for a second, so food today in general is highly disconnected from place and people. And so my research often focuses on food sustainability, which means connecting not only economics, but with environmental benefits. So kind of that integration of production and conservation, so that you're doing both things on the one piece of land. And then beyond that, so that there are social and cultural benefits embedded in the way that we produce food. So Indigenous foods, or bush foods, or native foods, there's a few names, but none of them are quite on point, really has gone through, as Chris pointed out, this sort of process of food colonization, where these foods have been colonized by non-Indigenous businesses. And I've just got a couple of quotes here from this really great article. If you come back and look at these slides, it's an article well worth reading. And the first quote there: "Remember, native foods are imbued not just with tens of thousands of years of Aboriginal knowledge, spirituality and cultural heritage, but also the racism, frontier violence, theft of land and children, and massacres that have defined this continent's more recent past." And then the second quote there from Bruce Pascoe: "I don't want Australians to dispossess us a second time by taking away our foods and the plants we domesticated all those years ago. I'm hoping they'll remember where it came from and include Aboriginal people in the bounty that will flow from using Australian foods. You can't eat our food if you can't swallow our history." And I think that understanding there's a global movement, Indigenous movement and an alliance for recognizing and respecting seed sovereignty, and understanding how connected seeds, especially grass seeds, are in culture and connections to country and language and kinship systems, everything. So seed sovereignty is becoming something that is being more and more discussed. And then I just thought I'd put in that little article that lends itself to what Chris mentioned before, where only 1% of businesses are being produced by Indigenous peoples. So the native grasses for greens case study, I thought if you didn't go to one of the first two webinars where Ange explained the use of these words in this case study, so these are Gamilaré words, Dunbar, Dunbarbilla and Duwar. And so Dunbar means grass seed that's ready for grinding. Dunbarbilla means a place of lots of edible grasses, and Duwar means bread made from native grasses. So just if you missed those first webinars, just wanted to pop that in there for you. And there's just a few points here that I have. So the first has been reiterated in other webinars, but the fact that that there is an instant way to be able to make money from native grass seeds by selling them to those ecological restoration groups, especially Greening Australia and places like that, means that this industry really has the potential to kick off with a good foundation through selling those grass seeds through other markets before the food market really takes off. A lot of people ask me, oh, but does knowledge still exist around, you know, which species are best to eat and how to grind them, how to thresh them, etc. And what I found is that the knowledge is there. It is a testament to Indigenous communities that this knowledge has survived so much cultural destruction and destruction of peoples. But it is there, and really it's about connecting people with knowledge, because as we found in some of our seminars or in some of our workshops, having multiple people in the room who start to make those connections starts to build that base. I know that agronomists, there is some advice around cultivating and plant breeding native grasses for grains, but I think that how that happens and where that happens will be very much based on the traditional owners and what they want out of the native grasses enterprise. As I mentioned, there is great potential to connect with the regenerative agriculture community, and beyond that with the conventional agriculture community who have unused parts of their land that could definitely be integrated into a value chain. I've also got this point here that in order to protect the sovereignty of this knowledge and these products, that really there should be efforts made to integrate the whole value chain so that Indigenous peoples own and control from planting and harvesting all the way down to eating. We need to ensure that Indigenous peoples are on the front line through and own and manage that whole process. And as Chris mentioned, so linking this to local Aboriginal land councils in particular, who often or sometimes own some land, but are predominantly in New South Wales especially reliant on government funding and government grants. So in general, local Aboriginal land councils really, when you do a bit of an investigation, just cover so many issues, from housing to health to language, to trying to protect Aboriginal heritage, fighting off developers. There's just so much those organisations do, and their core funding is sometimes enough to maybe hire 1 or 2 full-time people. So there's so much volunteerism that goes into those organisations, and this really offers potentially a way forward with generating income and reducing reliance or complementing that funding that comes in from external sources. And then the last point there is something that Chris has mentioned as well, that these products that would come from native grasses would really have a cultural provenance. And so consumers would have to be somewhat flexible with what's in season, what's coming, what mix of grains are being harvested in each field is going to be a bit different. And that will have to be part of the industry, which really starts to change our food systems again, from getting these sort of homogenized, like we won't pick up a tomato, or we won't, the big chains won't sell a tomato unless it looks perfect. We're undoing our food systems and going back to place. And I thought I'd just mention this little quote because really it's come through in some of the discussions with knowledge holders, and that is that Indigenous knowledge, elders, country and grains are all connected. And so a native grasses enterprise needs to embody that sentiment. I also just put in a few quotes here, just a few, that I will perhaps just run through really quickly, but they kind of are voices of Indigenous knowledge holders that speak to some of those points that I just mentioned. So the first one there, you've got to know that interconnectedness of everything that goes into that one piece of food. And when you know that, that'll tell you where it comes from, that'll tell you who that mob is, that'll tell you that country. So that'll tell you that language, and it can all speak for itself. We need to be careful not to go down that road where people want to make our grains bigger and bigger and bigger because the country can't support it. And we have to respect 120,000 years of our history where the old people were very satisfied with what Mother Earth could give them, and they worked with the earth rather than against the earth. It's a really important principle for us to remember and to teach our kids so that we can resist this desire to create a new plant. We want a plant that is good for country. And this final point from Rhonda Ashby is quite a pertinent point, I think. We want the employment, we want the recognition, we want the cultural and historical knowledge to be respected. We have to be really careful. There's an enormous amount of goodwill in the non-Aboriginal community that it often doesn't translate into money for us or employment for us, so we have to insist on it. And this brings me to my last slide, which is, if you are a non-Indigenous person and you do want to connect and reach out and be a part of this, I've just got a couple of points here. In most locations, your local Aboriginal Land Council should probably be your first port of call, because they are the peak body, but there might also be other Aboriginal services, language centres or health centres, etc., that you can reach out to. Also you can look for cultural connections through local institutions. So some universities and other institutions have an elder in residence. So you could connect with traditional owners in that way as well. But the main thing is to find a bridge. So to go through one of these, an existing organisation. Be clear about what you are offering or what sort of relationship you want. Be patient and be flexible. So as I mentioned before, local Aboriginal land councils are doing an awful lot on with not much funding. So sometimes you just have to be patient before people can get back to you. Create an MOU, so that's a memorandum of understanding, which is kind of an agreement that sets the rules or the rules of engagement. So it clearly sets out the expectations for you know, if you have some land and you have some native grasses and you want to offer that up for harvesting by your local Aboriginal Land Council, it would be good to have an MOU that stipulates any aspects of agreement that need to be in that. And maybe that includes aspects of respecting knowledge sovereignty and respecting Indigenous IP. And then just a couple of other points. So you could also attend a local cultural awareness course, invite an elder out to your private country to try and understand your country, or you could commission a cultural heritage assessment of your country as well. But the last point there is perhaps most important. You must practice reciprocity. You cannot ask for any more volunteer time than most Indigenous communities already give to their local Aboriginal land councils. So please remember that point when reaching out. Okay, thanks very much.
Beck, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. And I love hearing that connection that you display and you explain so eloquently of people and place. And it is something about the way our food systems are disconnected now, and people are disconnected from country, and how we can go back to that, or how we can at least find a version of it that goes forward, is a really, really important question. And I love your practical points on the last slide as well. That's a journey I've been going on. I'm still learning as a non-Aboriginal person. I'm very, very honoured at how much volunteer time people are offering myself and my work. And I seek in every way to reciprocate that where possible. And that's usually, we have our native flower trading system up here. So, you know, instead of the beer economy, it's the native flower trading economy, and it works really well. So thank you very much, Beck. And you've all probably noticed sitting behind me is a lovely gentleman. This is Dr. Tony Meppem, who's the head teacher from TAFE for agriculture. And he's up here, we're up here together at the Moree campus. I'm actually going to switch seats with him, and Tony's going to chat quickly about the next step. Right, Tony?
Front row seat. Good morning, everyone. How do you do? It's nice to be here. I participated in our last meeting last week on Tuesday and really enjoyed it. I'm here in Moree on Kamilaroi country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners past and present. I'd also like to thank Angela and the team at Sydney Uni for the work that they've done, really to inspire this broader conversation, and it's given a really broad range of people the imprimatur and the impetus to pursue this agenda further. I'd also like to thank Bernadette Duncan, who's been my cultural mentor. Bernadette from Boggabella has been my cultural mentor over the last few years. Sometimes this space can be difficult to work in when you're not Indigenous, and you know, I find having a mentor is a really important in moving forward. I'd really like to thank David Carr as well, who's been a private consultant, Chris Andrews and Rebecca, for their really informed positions that they brought to this dialogue. The little bit that I'd like to contribute is that in working for TAFE New South Wales, I've had the opportunity to work in communities throughout northwestern New South Wales here, and I've spoken to the people about the opportunities to move on from training into business and employment in ways that are culturally sensitive for them in doing the kinds of work that, you know, many people want to do work on country, but not necessarily in the traditional industrial agricultural scene, and to look at ways of working on their own country that they manage themselves in a more culturally appropriate way that provides opportunity for business and employment. Also, I think it's interesting that this broader discussion has been supported by Local Land Services, who are the primary manager of stock routes throughout New South Wales. And I do believe that, you know, those corridors, those linkages that stock routes offer throughout country are really important, and perhaps offer a future opportunity where perhaps you know, local Aboriginal lands councils can look at new ways of utilising these stock routes, and potentially you know, native grains offers that opportunity as well. So, you know, the absence of actual ownership of land may not be such a significant barrier. I'm here today to talk to you about a skill set, an agricultural skill set in native grains that we're developing in TAFE New South Wales. At the moment, we are looking for opportunities to fund this throughout the communities here in northwestern New South Wales, and then perhaps in you know, further throughout the state. We've identified that there's probably you know, if we to work for maybe 6 to 8 days on this issue, we would have the opportunity of working with people on country. We've spent an amount of time going through a knowledge sharing process. There's certainly been the gathering of knowledge from, you know, across the state, and in particular here in the northwest, regarding native grains and their potential for bread and for flour, and consequently bread and perhaps other flour-related products. We want to develop this skill set, so we're working on country, and we're developing the skills. So we've had the opportunity to talk a lot about the knowledge, but, you know, what are the issues when we actually want to develop the skills on country? What is the context on your country that is relevant to these native grasses in trying to move forward from knowledge to practice? So we've identified that there's the growing, the identification of plants, the growing of native grasses. You know, what's their culture? We heard last week about the opportunities of a more biodiverse mix or an exclusive mix of grains. So we're talking about you know, a landscape approach as to perhaps a more cultivated approach. People in different places are going to want a different approach. It may be a blending of both approaches so that we, in particular contexts, particular groups of people may want to do a bit of both, or there may be businesses available where Aboriginal people can come together and form their own business that may be entirely independent of anybody else. They may be able to do this in a way that doesn't have really onerous upfront capital requirements, or they may be able to look for joint venture partners. So there could be a whole range of different models that we may be able to talk about when we actually do a skill set. So that's that kind of first instance, and then we're going to look on the harvesting issues. So there's a whole range of issues that still sit there in relation to harvesting. So Angela's identified the challenges that she and Cal and Craigie faced in winnowing and separating the grain from the husks. There's still some experimentation that might be done on cool fire in relation to moving husk. There may be, just a greater focus on native millet, which seems to be a grass that responds well to fairly conventional kinds of harvesting. So in this skill set, we might be able to look at, different harvesting techniques and what works for you in your particular place, as Rebecca was talking about before. So in your niche of country. So in moving forward, we've all of us who have been involved in this webinar, and in particular the presenters who are, I suppose, offering themselves as contact people, are hoping that the sharing that's been going on, the knowledge sharing and the impetus and the enthusiasm associated with bringing forward an industry really in native grains can be maintained. And TAFE New South Wales think they can play a role in this. And I certainly think that they can. And I'm going to be looking to facilitate that opportunity through this skill set. So we're looking to provide a funded skill set so that it'll be a skill set in the growing and harvesting of native grains. And we're hoping that this skill set our plan is that this skill set will be free, provide free training on country in your location, contextualised to your needs and your particular varieties of native grasses. We're hoping in the first instance that will be offered in the range of communities. Perhaps I know some of you that are on this webinar. We're currently working in, throughout the northwest in Moree and Boggabilla, Walgett, Lightning Ridge, Mungandai, Bawarrina, right out to Burke. These are all places that traditionally had significant native grasslands. The climate hasn't changed that much that we can't still look to grow a good crop of native grasses there, and the opportunity for a perennial stand of grasses, these grasses that can be harvested in I suppose a slightly opportunistic way for depending on climate, but there are also opportunities to explore perhaps baling in, so harvesting them as bales of baled in kind of straw with the grain in there that could be put out as a conservation strategy. So who are our markets? We're not really sure. We're hoping that there are markets in the food market. Our initial explorations during the last 12 months suggest that the cotton industry are interested in this to address biodiversity targets on their riparian areas. The Australian Wildlife Conservancy, who are the largest private conservation group in Australia, are interested to improve the biodiversity on the areas they manage. We already know that many of our signature conservation areas, you know, experienced probably up to 150 years of fairly exploitive management before they were set aside as conservation areas in the form of national parks and state conservation areas, and that many of these places could do with some supplementary support in terms of regeneration from native grasses. Native grasses provides really the foundation in building the healthy ecosystem. It provides the habitat for the insects that feed many of the birds and many of the mammals, like bilbies, for instance. So that we're providing, by undertaking this strategy, we're looking at you know, building the ecosystem from the ground up. Native grasses will influence the biodiversity in the soils, the soil biota. So this strategy is really foundational in terms of building, you know, the biodiversity benefits that we're aiming to get. To be able to do that, of course, is dependent on what other benefits we might be able to get from this. And I was interested to hear Chris articulate some of those benefits. So it's very important that we're able to do this under a business model. There will be challenges in terms of refining that business model. You know, who's going to get out there and do the work, do the chipping, do the fencing, so that when we've got a crop of native grasses, that they're not going to be smashed by, you know, by kangaroos, for instance, when everybody else's country all around have been overgrazed, and the only available grass around is the you know, is the 1/2 kilometre long and the 300 metre wide patch of native grasses that a local Aboriginal business group, for instance, has been attending. So, you know, there are a whole range of practical issues about perhaps protecting these microcosms from predation that is different to the kinds of predation that would have happened pre-colonial times. If we can imagine pre-colonial times, Aboriginal people worked on a much broader landscape basis. So they, you know, may have been burning a portion of the landscape, you know, 20 kilometres over this way, and maintaining this part of the grassland to grow to seed. And, you know, the burnt areas, or the several burnt areas, are, you know, in another, you know, locality, but still within the area that was being managed, provided, you know, a green pick for the kangaroos to go to, so that they would have tended to congregate that way, and leaving these areas to be harvested. So there are a whole range of new complexities that are operating. Of course, it's the values that we're working with now, the values that Aboriginal people attribute to land to improve the health of land and consequently the health of people. So I encourage you to contact your local TAFE with an expression of interest if you are interested in doing this agricultural skill set that really engenders, if we get support from the community, if it's shown to be widespread interest from your community in doing something practical in relation to native grasses skill set in your community, well, that makes it, of course, a lot easier for that to happen. You know, we're able to build that support, you know, get a lot more support for the funding, and be able to do these initial skill sets to identify the key issues that we want to look at, and then you know, then explore the opportunities of, say, staying in that community for 6 months, working on these issues, looking at practically you know, doing this. So practically doing some land preparation, looking at what are the conditions that we need to produce to be able to actually put those native grains into the soil, work with the community of how we might be able to fund that, and work with the community on what kind of business model will sit around that, so that when there is production, you know, what's the business model? So there are a whole range of challenges there, I suppose, yet to go on. I think that really the biggest challenge that we've broken through, and you know, I'd really like to thank the reaching out that the Sydney Uni team have done, and the cultural sensitivity that with which they've done that. It seems to me that we've got a real broad enthusiasm now for this native grasses there, and you know, if we can maintain that, and if TAFE New South Wales can have a role, I think its role is in, you know, going to your local TAFE and saying, you know, I'm interested in this skill set in native grains, and that's where I feel that TAFE New South Wales can play a role in continuing this impetus. And I look forward to the opportunity of talking with you further on this, certainly throughout the end of this year, and hopefully next year when we can all get out and about a bit more and see each other on country. Thank you very much.
Indeed. That was great, Tony. Swap seats again for a minute. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, that's great to hear about the practicalities, isn't it, of how you might go forward, because you have a lot of questions, and I know that I've been asked as well. So, you know, I want to do something with native grains. What do I do? You know, should I register a business name? Should I go get a cultural heritage survey of my property? Should I collect some grains? Should I plant something? You know, what species do I work with? You know, I get these practical questions. And this is one solution that might be relevant to some people up here on Gomeroi country, and hopefully in other parts of Australia as well. You might have a registered training organisation like TAFE that can provide some training ongoing for people in your area. And as I understand the way it would work, you just have to grab roughly 10 people together and just say, hey, let's all do this course together. And then if you contact the TAFE or the RTO, they'll actually come to you. And they'll do the training on your property or in your lands council or in a community hall or wherever. Is this, I'm saying this right? Yep. And so they come to you. And so that's when Tony talks about coming on country. That is that connecting people back to place again, which is so important to actually get this system going. And doing it, not doing it in a classroom, but actually doing it, physically doing it, either in a field or in a bakery, actually physically doing it together. And that's that connection that's going to really get the momentum going. So one option for you, contact your TAFE, register your interest, but you also might have other similar options on your country that might be relevant. And as Beck said, definitely speak to the local Aboriginal community as well, and share your interest and desire to learn in this space as well. And they're two practical things that we can all take going forward. We're pretty much out of time. I'd like to thank our speakers. I will have a quick look at the chat and see if there's anyone else that really wants to ask a question. You can just take 30 seconds now and pop it in there. Oh, here we go. The name of the man talking is Tony Meppem. There we go. We got that one. Good stuff from Beck there. I think Beck and Chris have answered those ones there. Okay, very cool. So if you guys would like to ask questions of any of the panelists as well. Oh, here's one. Can the course be taken interstate? That's one for Tony.
In border towns.
In border towns. I think the general idea is in concept, yes. In concept. So the practicalities, at the moment Tony works for New South Wales TAFE. But the concept is now there, and part of what we want to do in this knowledge sharing workshop is also get teaching tools out to communities and people. So we've got these webinars are recorded, but we've also made short kind of 5-minute videos as well, and these sorts of teaching tools can be applied in other parts of Australia as well. So it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be a matter of ensuring that we have the expertise to be able to do the training, and as Angela said, the development of the resources. So that's a lot of that's been happening now through the last 12 to 18 months. 18 months ago, we didn't know nearly as much as we do now in terms of how to grow them and what were the key species and, what were the networks. So we're a long way along the path to being able to, package up something in terms of training.
Great. Yes. Excellent. Okay, well, we'll wrap it up now. Thank you everyone for participating. It's been wonderful to share knowledge together. Again, feel free to use the chat box for the last 30 seconds to connect with one another. I saw one on there, but please also, please do share websites, resources, useful information. This is a chance for us to connect together. And while people are doing that, I'd just like to remind you, if you were sent a separate link by Cara this morning or previously to join another discussion, you'll just have to close this Zoom link and open the second Zoom link to join that discussion. Thank you very much to LLS again for supporting these webinars. Thanks everyone for participating. And we would like to form some sort of native grains group going forward. Don't know how, don't know where, don't know when. But if you would like to stay in touch, please let us know, and we can start to figure out how the community can really drive this going forward. I think the term that's been used, Beck used it today, is food sovereignty. And so I think getting food sovereignty in the right hands is really important going forward. So let's work on that together. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be in touch soon. Yalu.